Chapters 75 and 76 of The Way of All Flesh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. The Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler. Chapter 75. In the month of September 1860 a girl was born, and Ernest was proud and happy. The birth of the child, and a rather alarming talk which the doctor had given to Ellen, sobered her for a few weeks, and it really seemed as though his hopes were about to be fulfilled. The expenses of his wife's confinement were heavy, and he was obliged to trench upon his savings, but he had no doubt about soon recouping this now that Ellen was herself again. For a time, indeed, his business did revive a little. Nevertheless, it seemed as though the interruption to his prosperity had in some way broken the spell of good luck which had attended him in the outset. He was still sanguine, however, and worked night and day with a will, but there was no more music or reading or writing now. His Sunday outings were put to a stop, and but for the first floor being let to myself, he would have lost his citadel there too, but he seldom used it, for Ellen had to wait more and more upon the baby, and as a consequence Ernest had to wait more and more upon Ellen. One afternoon, about a couple of months after the baby had been born, and just as my unhappy hero was beginning to feel more hopeful, and therefore better able to bear his burdens, he returned from a sale, and found Ellen in the same hysterical condition that he had found her in the spring. She said she was again with child, and Ernest still believed her. All the troubles of the preceding 6 months began again then and there, and grew worse and worse continually. Money did not come in quickly, for Ellen cheated him by keeping it back, and dealing improperly with the goods he bought. When it did come in, she got it out of him as before, on pretexts which it seemed inhuman to inquire into. It was always the same story. By and by a new feature began to show itself. Ernest had inherited his father's punctuality and exactness as regards money. He liked to know the worst of what he had to pay at once. He hated having expenses sprung upon him which, if not foreseen, might and ought to have been so. But now bills began to be brought to him for things ordered by Ellen without his knowledge, or for which he had already given her the money. This was awful, and even Ernest turned. When he remonstrated with her, not for having bought the things, but for having said nothing to him about the money's being owing, Ellen met him with hysteria, and there was a scene. She had now pretty well forgotten the hard times she had known when she had been on her own resources, and reproached him downright with having married her. On that moment the scales fell from Ernest's eyes as they had fallen when Towneley had said, "No, no, no." He said nothing, but he woke up once for all to the fact that he had made a mistake in marrying. A touch had again come which had revealed him to himself. He went upstairs to the disused citadel, flung himself into the armchair, and covered his face with his hands. He still did not know that his wife drank, but he could no longer trust her, and his dream of happiness was over. He had been saved from the church, so as by fire, but still saved. But what could now save him from his marriage? He had made the same mistake that he had made in wedding himself to the church, but with 100 times worse results. He had learnt nothing by experience. He was an Esau, one of those wretches whose hearts the Lord had hardened, who having ears heard not, having eyes saw not, and who should find no place for repentance, though they sought it even with tears. Yet had he not, on the whole, tried to find out what the ways of God were, and to follow them in singleness of heart? To a certain extent, yes. But he had not been thorough. He had not given up all for God. He knew that very well he had done little as compared with what he might and ought to have done. But still, if he was being punished for this, God was a hard taskmaster, and one too who was continually pouncing out upon his unhappy creatures from ambuscades. In marrying Ellen he had meant to avoid a life of sin, and to take the course he believed to be moral and right. With his antecedents and surroundings, it was the most natural thing in the world for him to have done. Yet in what a frightful position had not his morality landed him! Could any amount of immorality have placed him in a much worse one? What was morality worth if it was not that which on the whole brought a man peace at the last? And could anyone have reasonable certainty that marriage would do this? It seemed to him that in his attempt to be moral he had been following a devil which had disguised itself as an angel of light. But if so, what ground was there on which a man might rest the sole of his foot and tread in reasonable safety? He was still too young to reach the answer. On common sense. An answer which he would have felt to be unworthy of anyone who had an ideal standard. However this might be, it was plain that he had now done for himself. It had been thus with him all his life. If there had come at any time a gleam of sunshine and hope, it was to be obscured immediately. Why, prison was happier than this. There, at any rate, he had no money anxieties, and these were beginning to weigh upon him now with all their horrors. He was happier even now than he had been at Battersby or at Roughborough, and he would not go back, even if he could, to his Cambridge life. But for all that, the outlook was so gloomy, in fact so hopeless, that he felt as if he could have only too gladly gone to sleep and died in his armchair once for all. As he was musing thus and looking upon the wreck of his hopes, for he saw well enough that as long as he was linked to Ellen he should never rise as he had dreamed of doing, he heard a noise below, and presently a neighbour ran upstairs and entered his room hurriedly. "Good gracious, Mr Pontifex," she exclaimed, "for goodness' sake come down quickly and help. Oh, Mrs Pontifex is took with the horrors, and she's orkered." The unhappy man came down as he was bid, and found his wife mad with delirium tremens. He knew all now. The neighbours thought he must have known that his wife drank all along, but Ellen had been so artful, and he so simple, that, as I have said, he had had no suspicion. "Why," said the woman who had summoned him, "she'll drink anything she can stand up and pay her money for." Ernest could hardly believe his ears, but when the doctor had seen his wife, and she had become more quiet, he went over to the public house hard by and made inquiries, the result of which rendered further doubt impossible. The publican took the opportunity to present my hero with a bill of several pounds for bottles of spirits supplied to his wife, and what with his wife's confinement and the way business had fallen off, he had not the money to pay with, for the sum exceeded the remnant of his savings. He came to me, not for money, but to tell me his miserable story. I had seen for some time that there was something wrong, and had suspected pretty shrewdly what the matter was, but of course I said nothing. Ernest and I had been growing apart for some time. I was vexed at his having married, and he knew I was vexed, though I did my best to hide it. A man's friendships are, like his will, invalidated by marriage, but they are also no less invalidated by the marriage of his friends. The rift in friendship which invariably makes its appearance on the marriage of either of the parties to it was fast widening, as it no less invariably does into the great gulf.